come and I say thank you everybody for being here. Did anybody get the red button there yet, JP?
Yeah.
Good, thank you. This will all be edited out. It's a real treat tonight. Josh Rager is our newest prof in the specialization in jazz studies, pianist extraordinaire, and with a very, very long track record of performances, touring, recording, everything, writing, arranging, so on and so on. So, and he's going to be speaking to us tonight about the music of Woody Shaw. What I didn't know was that Professor Charles Ellison, who's the coordinator of the specialization in jazz studies, is joining Josh. So it is a big delight and a big surprise to welcome Professor Ellison as well. And that's all you need to hear from me. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. And over to you.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for braving the treacherous, icy streets.
Hey, turn off your cell phones.
Oh. Yeah, so have you guys all heard of Woody Shaw? Do you know? He had a relatively short career in jazz, but had a very important contribution to the music. And he's somebody who I've always been particularly attracted to, both the sound of his playing and the sound of his compositions. So, in fact, I would like to just thank one of my mentors in the creation of this project. Originally, many years ago, when I did my master's, I studied with a professor named Jan Yarchik, who also taught at Concordia at one point. I don't think anybody, Christine and Charles remember Jan, and he was at McGill, and he was my one of my mentors there. He was my piano teacher, and it was really Jan who turned me on to the music of Woody Shaw and got me really into it. And it's just great, listen to your teacher's recommendations, because more often than not, they will know people that you wouldn't normally get exposed to. They will expose you. So that kind of happened with me and Woody Shaw. So I'd like to just give you some context a little bit about him personally. He's born in Laurinburg, North Carolina in 1944, and kind of a musical family. His father was in, I don't know if you guys would have heard of this, but the Diamond Jubilee Singers was a pretty big touring vocal group back in the day. And Woody Shaw's father was actually the lead singer, and had also attended the same high school as Dizzy Gillespie. So Woody, from a very young age, would hear stories from his father about Dizzy Gillespie, and he would hear a lot about local jazz musicians and the famous jazz musicians who passed through his area. And he constantly made reference to that in interviews. And I have in my slide here, attributes it to his deep sense of pride and cultural awareness and spiritual devotion to music. He felt very close on a very deep personal and spiritual level to music. But it wasn't jazz at first. In fact, he studied trumpet kind of as a fluke. He wanted to play other instruments at school, and trumpet was kind of the last one that was available to him. And he played in the drum and bugle corps, and initially studied classical music. And he had high ambitions of becoming a classical virtuoso, and he wanted to attend Juilliard. And that was really instilled from his father. So his exposure to jazz happened relatively later in his teen years. But of course, being such a great trumpet player, he was working fairly regularly by the age of 14. So he was a virtuoso. So he pretty much was on the scene from the 1960s. His first major recording date was with Eric Dolphy, who's an avant-garde saxophone player. And he made a recording with him in 1963. And it was really Eric Dolphy who took him under his wing. Try to get in the Skype shot there. And exposed Woody to a lot of avant-garde sounds. And basically what I mean by avant-garde is the musicians and the music that was really pushing the envelope, trying to get to the edges of what sounded tonal and inside. The avant-garde was trying to get outside of the box. And if you know Eric Dolphy's playing, he sounds very outside of the box. He was so outside of the box that he really wasn't accepted by and large from the jazz community. Miles Davis hated him, for example. Yeah. So, but on the other hand, he did put out records on Blue Note, and he did do tours. He played with John Coltrane. And we'll see in a second why this is possible for there to be overlapping musical styles within jazz at the time. Unfortunately, Eric Dolphy also passed away at an early age. While they were on tour, Woody Shaw was in his band in Europe, and Eric Dolphy, who was diabetic, had a diabetic seizure and passed away quite tragically. And so Woody Shaw ended up staying in France, and he was also able to be mentored by a lot of great expatriate jazz musicians from the United States, like Bud Powell. Kenny Clark was also in France. There were a whole bunch of people there at the time. Dexter Gordon was also there. And moving back to the United States in 1965, he joined Horace Silver's band. So a really different musical genre from Eric Dolphy. He was now playing hard bop music. He basically worked as a sideman in a lot of A-list bands in the 1960s. And you can hear Woody's original music appearing for the first time on Larry Young's seminal recording, Unity, in which he had 3 of his compositions recorded. So the 1960s, he started to release his own records. He first worked for Muse Records. And back then you signed a contract, and the record company owned your records, and they would pay you for your recording dates. So it was actually in your interest to record as often as possible, which was both good and bad. You'll notice that the quality of jazz recordings, because they were so numerous, the quality varies from recording to recording, especially with smaller labels. They would pay the musicians an amount of money, not just for the recording, but for the amount of original compositions on that recording. Miles Davis was famed for stealing people's music, because when it came time to sign the contract, he would just put his name beside other people's compositions, and he'd get a bit more cash in the envelope. That was kind of the climate. He continued to work as a sideman, but he appeared on this really important record by Dexter Gordon, who, as I mentioned before, was living in Europe. He moved back to the United States in 1976 and recorded this record called Homecoming. And Woody Shaw is on that. And that was a major Columbia Records release. And then Woody Shaw was able to work for Columbia Records after that. His first record being Rosewood. So some of the names of musicians that Woody Shaw had in his bands, now that he was becoming a big name himself and touring, he worked with musicians like Mulgrew Miller, Victor Lewis, Larry Willis, Steve Turre, Stafford James. These were all people who went on to have important careers in their own right in the 70s and 80s. So the 1980s, he was very active, touring and recording under his own name. However, aside from suffering from an incurable degenerative eye disease, was it glaucoma that he had? He had a very serious, he was losing his eyesight. He was basically almost blind, I think, by the end of his life. He also suffered from what was probably a mental illness, which he self-medicated and used drugs for, and unfortunately had a very tragic accident. He was struck by a subway car at the end of his life, and then he died in hospital due to complications from that. His son produced a documentary on Woody Shaw, which I haven't seen, which came out, I think, last year. And apparently it's supposed to be very in-depth about his life and his music. So let's talk about his music a little bit. So, the modern jazz composer. Now, I referred to before here, I'll show you my fancy, look at that, I learned how to use PowerPoint for this. Jazz composition hierarchy. Okay, so we had this big band swing era, which some of you, who studied jazz history at this point? So you guys might be a little bit familiar with this. The trouble with jazz history is that it moves so quickly and it so overlaps with everything that you literally have multiple genres and styles coexisting all throughout the 20th century. But this is going to help us to frame what I mean by modern jazz composition. So we have this big band era, and out of it came these two main branches. What was known as the third stream, which is the combination of classical music and jazz. And that came out of Paul Whiteman and big band era composers who, and Duke Ellington among them, who really tried to make big band music a high level, almost classical art form. But at the same time, we had these guys like Charlie Parker who were populating the big bands, the players in the big bands, who developed soloing and improvisation. And then these two things coexist. You've got musicians who appear like Art Farmer, who learned from the bebop school, who would be on records of George Russell, and who would improvise bebop-type solos in the context of this classical jazz kind of music. Bill Evans was another person who came out of bebop. We don't really hear Bill Evans, the pianist, in a bebop context nearly as much as we do in a modal context. He played with Miles Davis. But then Bill Evans played with George Russell. So it really overlaps a lot of this stuff. And what I mean by modern jazz composition is the music that appears after these guys. So let me just go back. And this is sort of what I say. Each era and genre overlaps, one building on what was made possible in the past. Many musicians came up and were schooled in one era, but made their own contributions in another. So Charlie Parker came up playing big band music, but then made his great contribution to jazz in playing bebop solos. Okay, now we get to, I'm going to get a little bit technical. Who are the music students here? Yes. Excellent. This is the best thing that I could do on PowerPoint, but I think I'm going to draw it on the board over here because I'm more of a circles person. All right, so we've got these two worlds coexisting, not just in jazz, but in lots of music in the 20th century. And basically it's characterized by tonal music and atonal music. We've got these two contending forces. All of the tonality and atonality had really run its course in classical music pretty much by the 20th century. By the time we get to atonal music, we're really done with tonal music. But that's not the case in jazz. Jazz comes up using very tonal harmony and pretty much to this day bases the framework of its improvisation on tonality. However, tonality becomes very boring from a compositional standpoint. We really are done with tonality in terms of composing music. So there starts to exist this love child between tonality and atonality. And this child has attributes from both. One of the things that we could say characterizes tonal music is the use of asymmetrical scales. Or asymmetry. Asymmetrical scales. Does everybody know what I mean by an asymmetrical scale? It's a scale that uses a smattering of intervals. So the major scale goes whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, half step. It's not really a pattern. The pattern exists once we get to the octave. Within the octave, there isn't really a pattern. And all tonal scales are said to be asymmetrical from that point of view. as opposed to symmetrical sounds, what was the very famous symmetrical sound that we think of in atonal music? 12-tone. 12-tone music, they decided to do away, one of the ways in which you can do away with tonality is by making all 12 chromatic pitches equal in this great democracy. So as soon as you make a symmetrical sound, you start to lose tonality. And that's really where jazz composition starts to blossom in a modern sense. We start to have composers use the modes, and we also have composers start to divide the octaves symmetrically. And I'll just give you a little demonstration. I'm a musician, like I'm a performer and a player, and I believe everything needs to be demonstrated so that you can hear the sound. So let's say we have this tonic chord, and the tonic chord really is just your one chord, it's home. Okay? And home bass, yeah, you can turn on the lights if you want. Or turn off the lights.
No, it won't work. They are like it's half its on and half its off just because they are gone. They're dead. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got home bass. Tonal music requires that chords follow one another in a certain order, and this is known as functional harmony. So only certain chords can precede the home chord, and we have a cadence. In classical music, it would sound like this. Jazz music, it would sound like this. And there's only a certain number of chords that could precede the chord that precedes the home chord. In classical music, it would be, right? Everybody recognizes this.
Yeah.
We start to hear a chord progression which embodies tonality. And there's strict rules. And they're not my rules. I don't know where those rules came from. It's sort of like the lineage of Western music imprinted this sound in our minds. And everybody, the most uneducated layperson in music, can tell when those chords go out of order. If we can go 1, 5, but then we have to go back to 1 again somehow. If we go to 4, we're definitely going to have to go to 1. Jazz musicians could only spice up the chords. They couldn't change the order. So if we spice up the chord, we might go. Spicy. Right? So they just become complex sounds. Well, musicians were tired of that by the 1950s. They wanted to be able to improvise on functional chord progressions, but they didn't want the sound of their music to be primarily characterized by tonality. So they started exploring modal sounds, and in the case of Woody Shaw, he was really into exploring symmetrical divisions of the octave. So what do I mean by that? So let's throw out the word tonic, and let's call our home bass something that emits gravity. Let's say that tonality is no longer a tonic sound, subdominant sound. You guys studied all of that. Let's say it's like the planet Jupiter, and it wants to suck everything towards it, which frees us up from having to play chords in a certain order. Because all we have to do to create a sound or a song is to have chords sound like they're being sucked towards something that is emitting gravity. You know, they just found gravity waves. So
Yeah, they just did.
they just proved that gravity exists in waves. I still don't know what that means. But it means gravity's going out and grabbing things and trying to pull them in. So our one chord exists as some kind of gravitational orb. I'll demonstrate what I mean. What was the way in which I divided the octave just now? I divided it chromatically. Okay, etc. So you can divide it 11 times. And here's what a chord progression based on a purely chromatic division of the octave sounds like. Right? We now are attracted to the one chord as a function of gravity as opposed to a function of, well, functional harmony. We can go up. And we can stop anywhere. And return back to one. And it sounds like we're going home somehow. And as long as we repeat, let me give you my, as long as we follow a couple of rules, repetition of the tonic chord, so that we start with the tonic chord and end with the tonic chord, we can really do anything in the middle. The other thing is we have to use the octave as a means of establishing stable limits. So we can't go outside of the octave. We have to think of the octave as the unit that's being divided. And then as long as I play the tonic chord at the beginning and at the end of my piece, it's going to sound like home. Let's do it another way. What's another way of dividing an octave equally?
Whole tones.
Hmm?
Whole tones.
Whole tone, exactly. Everybody know your whole tone scales? Well, you better if you're an improviser. Improvisers have to know these scales. And we lose a note, but it's, I mean, as like if you compare the whole tone scale to a major scale, it's a 6-note scale instead of a 7-note scale. But it's symmetrical in that you've got 6 whole tones. So now let's try our major 7 chord moving in whole steps. Right? Sounds like we arrived home somehow. Right? I'm just playing major 7 chords, by the way. I'm not using any other type of chord. So what do you think? Are you buying it so far?
Yeah.
Because it's okay if there's dissenters. This is literally an explanation that I've come up with to understand Woody Shaw's music when I hear it. Okay, let's hear from somebody else. What's another way of dividing?
Diminish.
Yeah, diminish, great. We see this a lot in classical music, right? So let's divide, by the way, this is all.
It's
Okay,
very
so
interesting because the sharp 5 and the sharp 6 there of the whole tone scale kind of becomes like the flat 6, flat 7 parallel of your minor scale. So it makes it sound really grounded.
well, that's a really good point. There are modal relationships that we're overlapping with. Flat 6, flat 7 is part of a modal scale, definitely. It's part of the natural minor scale, right? We would be blending the major and the natural minor scale. A lot of pop songs do that. Yeah, but they don't have
The sharp
gonads.
4.
You rarely hear that in pop music. Maybe in the 80s. But they wouldn't ever go through the whole scale though.
Yeah, that sharp 4 kills everybody.
Yeah, as soon as you go, then it's like, okay guys.
Where the
this
heck
is
are
not-
Your planet has just flown off.
Yeah. Okay, let's try dividing the octave into 4 now. Still sounds like we arrive home. So we're gonna see in a minute how Woody Shaw uses, and this is what I mean by multi-tonics. There is no longer there's no longer one chord. There are many one chords. And then there's a kind of like a larger one chord than the others. That planet Jupiter that's sucking in all of the other chords towards it. Did I forget one? Oh yeah, I forgot one. There's one other way of dividing the octave. You can divide the octave in major thirds to create an augmented triad. If you go up a major third to E, up a major third to G sharp, and then a major third would be your octave again.
But isn't that just a function of the whole tone scale anyways?
Well,
It's the 1, 3, 5 of the whole tone scale.
it is yeah, you're right. It does sound whole tonish. Yeah, it sounds like, but there's a special relationship in jazz with the augmented. There's actually a different scale
Oh, okay.
in jazz that can accompany this. That would be different from the whole tone scale.
Okay.
Whole tone scale would imply a dominant sound because you've got this note really is like this scale would be played on C7. You've got the major third, the flat 7. But in this case, the chord symbol for this would be C major 7, sharp 5, which actually takes a different scale.
Huh.
So it's kind of a different sound. The whole tone sound is a dominant sound. Right, you hear a dominant, but the major 7 could have a major 7 on it. You hear how it sounds really different? Oops. So C, E, and A flat. That sounds like Holst. Well, you know where it's from. Holst used this quite a lot. You hear that in John Williams soundtracks?
Yeah.
We all stole it from Strauss. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but you're exactly right. Wagner as well.
Yeah.
The Tristan and Isolde
Oh, yeah.
chord was like an augmented
United
sound.
States, yeah.
So it's kind of, and in jazz, like Coltrane really developed that sound. So let's try our multi-tonics on that. And in fact, there's a really famous jazz tune based on these 3 chords. You guys all know this? Yeah, Jeff. Thank you. So the 3 chords is B, E flat, and G. You know how that sounds like one?
It does. It's a miracle.
It's a miracle.
It's a miracle.
Well, you can't, and that's why we're not changing keys, we're not tonicizing other key areas. We're literally playing multiple tonics all at the same time. We've got many ones. The Jupiter and its many moons. And that's sort of the model that I want you guys to have in mind for Woody Shaw's music. So, any questions so far? Comments?
I'm really curious with that because I've been talking in my music history class a lot about the symmetrical scales and this same revolution kind of in classical music.
Okay.
One of the other ways that also happened, besides just the symmetrical scales, was the use of the perfect fourth instead of the thirds to build chords, the
Okay.
chordal chords. Did
Yeah.
that happen in jazz too?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's all fourths instead of all thirds.
Well, what they ended up doing was using fourths as a more ambiguous kind of sound.
Yeah, but it still has a tonic.
Yeah, exactly. But they use it a lot in modal music.
Okay.
The famous example of that would be right? This tune's So What? You hear Bill Evans, the chord symbol is D minor 7, but they're not going like that. They're playing chords with fourths in it. So it doesn't become nearly as important in terms of harmony. It's more a means to express harmony in a more ambiguous way.
Yeah, that's kind of how it was used in more classical type music too. It was helping to blur things by getting rid of the thirds altogether. Though.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're blurring.
And it was
things.
really effective. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's it. Modern composition, not just in jazz, but in all 20th century, like that characterizes the 20th century.
Let's get rid of this stuff. Yeah.
How do you? Yeah, exactly. This stuff is so boring, but what do you do next? And that really was a problem. We're now kind of in a postmodern era, in which since about 1980, you see a lot of retro movements. So, and this happens from time to time in history. You get really far, and then people go, slow down, let's go back. So in jazz, you really have a return to very old sounds. You've got the New Orleans Preservation Jazz Band being a really popular band, and they're playing traditional New Orleans style jazz music. And at the same time, you've got cutting edge performers in New York City trying to do things entirely for the first time with harmony. So we kind of exist in this nether region right now, where there's like multiple movements and genres and styles going on. Yep.
The question, so for the moment that you were talking about the fourth subdivision, was that the altered scale?
Which one?
Like the relationship of that sharp 5 on the underneath the chord?
No, it's not the altered scale, it's called the augmented scale.
Okay.
It's a symmetrical scale, minor third semitone, minor third semitone, minor third semitone. Minor third semitone. Yeah, I'll play it again. It's 3 triads stretched out. So put those notes in order and you get spooky sound, eh? When it's used, I'll try to use it actually, because there's some augmented major 7 chords, and we're gonna play a couple of Woody Shaw tunes, so I'll try to show you. Yeah, let's see. I think that's it for my slides. Fancy, eh? Yay.
Yay.
All right. So, would you guys like to hear some of his music?
Absolutely.
All right. So I'm very, very happy that Charles Ellison has come to play these tunes. Not just because he's a great trumpet player, but he personally knew Woody Shaw. He introduced himself to Woody, who passed through Montreal several times, and I guess like you guys hung out lots too, eh?
Yeah, we did. We cooked a lot, and we talked about art, politics, and music. We were just good friends, really, really good friends, really good friends.
Maybe you could shut
Woody
off
used
the
to-
projector, sorry, just because it's shining right on Charles's
turn it off?
face.
Okay.
Glare there.
I was gonna say, Woody invited you up on stage with him too, didn't he?
Yeah, whenever he came to town, we would play together. We would play together.
Wow.
My first time playing with him was at the former Rising Sun.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And I knew he was coming to town, so I went down to meet him when he came to the club. The musicians would always come in the afternoon and have a rehearsal. So he came in and I introduced myself, and he was playing this beautiful Italian horn. He just returned from mentally, and he was giving this wonderful horn. I asked him if I could play it. He said, yeah. So I went in the back room and I played for a while. And I got back, he said, was that my horn you were playing? I said, yeah. He took it and he played about 27 courses of giant steps. And some trumpet players think, you know. Anyway, we were really good friends. Very, very good friends.
Cool. So your homework while we play our first tune is to try to figure out which subdivision of the octave is being featured in this octave. You want to do tomorrow's Destiny?
Yeah.
Test is at 9.
Yeah, exactly. In order to get your free food, you're going to have to give me the correct answer. Because it's not obvious. It's a feature of his composition, but like I said, jazz wanted to blend both tonal and atonal sounds. So it's in there, but you're going to have to discover it. All right.
You want to say something about the form of this?
The form is rather long and confusing to me. It has many sections. It's, according to my chart, it's 30 bars long. No, that can't be right. I think I have a pickup bar, so it's... Well, it has repeated section. It has repeated 8-bar sections,
Yeah.
basically.
It's actually about 51 bars. it's
But he's only playing 30. You better watch out.
Tomorrow's Destiny.
Tomorrow's Destiny.
All right. One, two, one, two, three, four. Okay, so who knows what division of the octave this feature? Yeah?
Augmented scale? Second one?
There was some augmented chords in there.
Because it was like 1 flat 6, 1 flat 6. then
Yeah,
A.
that's true. The first two chords. I know. It was on. Yep.
Whole tone?
Yes.
Because I
A lot of
heard,
them.
let's say, flat 7, 1, so D flat, E flat going to F minor. But
There-
I mean, I picked the whole tone, it would be more like sharp 5, sharp 6, C sharp, D sharp, F minor.
That's right. But one's minor.
Yeah.
And in the bridge, we had this. Here we get back to 1. So these key centers are B major, A major, G major, and F. And then there's the rest of the notes from the whole tone scale. So the main arrival points fall, and he uses every single note in the whole tone scale. But it's really, it's not necessarily that obvious. You can't throw out the craft of composition. If your musical devices serve any other purpose than producing something that has an interesting sound, then it becomes a math experiment. So what I've noticed about really deep music for me is that it has a sound that I'm really attracted to, and then when I investigate that sound, there's something going on behind the scenes that you can actually say, you can actually point to and say, oh, there's this happening in it, you know? So there's definitely a strong whole tone sound to it.
What's the name of the tone again?
It's called Tomorrow's Destiny.
You could hear the whole tones in the trumpet.
Yeah.
You had that melody.
Mm-hmm.
It's the 6.
Yeah, right. So it's a whole tone composition. Interesting, eh? You want to try our last one? All right, this one's going to be harder.
Uh-oh.
Or easier. Now that we have our heads in the game, maybe it's definitely harder to play this one.
Skype here for
Darren's, what is it called?
Oh, this tune is called In Case You Haven't Heard.
Just make sure Jake Philip is on the screen there, please.
Yeah. I'll just set up the time. mean, anybody want to venture a guess? In a way, this one's easier because there's more possibilities. There is definitely a whole tone sound.
Oh,
right?
lots.
It is interspersed with chromatic shifts.
Tons of chromatic shifts.
Yeah.
But and then on the B section we go. Oh wait, did I play that right? Yeah. And in fact, the soloing section is based on those 4 chords, which is the diminished
Yeah.
division. So that's what we were blowing on. B major 7, sharp 11, D major 7, F, and A flat. So you kind of learn from that a lot of these division of the octave type of multi-tonic things are kind of compatible with each other. This solo section really comes out of nowhere on this tune. It's not at all in the body of the tune. It has nothing to do with the changes.
Yeah.
He just kind of adds it on. But it works somehow. I don't know.
Let's
So
make
there
it
you
work.
go. What do you think?
Cool.
All right. Very cool.
Can I add a couple of things?
Yeah, please.
Woody Shaw's son, Woody Shaw Jr., as Josh mentioned, made a documentary on him. He has a website, and I encourage you to check it out. Woody Shaw Jr. Just check his website out. There are all kinds of materials there, videos of Woody playing, interviews, all kinds of things of Woody's talking about the music and stuff. And you can find online lots of interviews where he's talking about jazz education, so forth and so on. He worked as an educator himself with Jamie Ebersol for some time, and he would come to Montreal. He didn't really teach here when he came to Montreal. He did so in Toronto, taught some clinics in Toronto, but he was just a giant of a player, a very curious mind, very, very curious mind, and he was very welcoming to me and to everyone. You know, he was just a really warm, beautiful spirit, and he was very proud. He, in his terms of losing his eyesight, he was a Tai Chi practitioner. So at the Rising Sun, he'd be doing his Tai Chi stuff, doing the breaks. You know, he found it, and you couldn't bother him. He'd do Tai Chi during the whole break. You know, and he was very, very, very special. And I just encourage you to check him out. He's a great player. And Josh has done a wonderful job of unearthing some of his study and stuff, because we would talk about this stuff sometimes, but jazz musicians really talk more in parables than this is this and this. So he'd say something and he'd give me a little parable about this and that. But that's just part of the tradition, the way that the music is passed on from one generation to the next. And Woody Shaw is beautiful, and I'd like to, let's all commend Josh for his wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you.
I just want to ask Baron, do you and your students have any questions for Josh or for Charles?
I think Nelson has the question. So for my own work, I've been kind of, sorry about that, hold on 1 second. Okay?
Yeah,
We're fine.
We're okay.
Okay. So anyway, I've always heard that one of Woody Shaw's kind of significant contributions, or kind of another defining feature of his playing style is his use of pentatonic scales, things like that. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about what kind of makes his approach different than, say, the way McCoy Tyner and John Coltrane to a certain extent approach those kind of that style of improvisation.
Wow.
Yeah, I think it's the fact that he subdivides the octave so many different ways. I mean, you can hear him play it's not so much that they play that they. If you look at the scales that Woody plays, okay, they play the pentatonic with the minor form, the major pentatonic. They play the pentatonic, the minor form with the flat 5. They play the major form with the sharp 5. Different things like that. But it depends that their application had to do with emotional content. When Train plays, say, Love Supreme, you know, if you actually listen to the Love Supreme, you listen to McCoy solo. And McCoy comes at it from a certain way, he's using pentatonics. Train comes at it in a certain way, using pentatonics. If you listen to Woody play on any of his tunes, he's using pentatonics, but they really reflect his emotional bearing. You know, they reflect his emotional bearing. So one of the ways that he would do it, he would sit down at the piano and he'd play a chord, or I would play a chord, and put the sustain pedal on, and then he'd say, "This is what I feel about this," and just play some pentatonics around that. Put another one on and play some pentatonics on that. And say, "I don't know about that," or "Charles, what do you think about that?" So forth and so on. So it's that kind of a thing, as opposed to I'm using this particular kind of scale. There's so many possibilities of scales to use, and he would simply use them as according to how he felt at the moment.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question, Charles, for you. Playing some of those patterns, the pentatonic patterns, what Nelson was asking about, do they lay well on the trumpet?
Not all of them. Not all of them. Not this one. Oh boy. In fact, this is not pentatonic, but yeah. Oh, that's so mean. Oh, that's so beautiful. So a lot of the things lay really easily on the trumpet, and some of them not so easily. Not so easily. So you just have to take your time and slow it down. Play them on a ballad. Play them on different things, and see how they sit under your fingers. You know. If I play. That stuff lays okay for the trumpet. But if I do that kind of stuff gets a little more challenging, you know. A little more challenging.
Thank you.
So is music, under which category would you put it?
Well, that's it.
Is there
That's what I
any-
mean. From
there is
1960 on, the categories get really tricky.
Okay.
It's a very tricky thing. His music is entirely the sound of his own music.
Okay.
Yeah.
And composers pretty much become more individualistic from 1960 on. Like when you hear Wayne Shorter's music, it doesn't really sound like anything else. It becomes a lot less generic sounding. Not that the composers before sounded generic, all of them. But for example, in the big band era, you know, there's a lot of big band composers that sound like each other. So it really becomes an art music, and it's very individual. Sort of postmodern.
Everything goes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, like jazz today. I mean, what is jazz? Every person in this room is going to have a different sound in their head or a different picture in their head of what jazz is, which is great. I think it's good.
One of the points that Josh made was earlier in the presentation that was really, really significant. I don't know if you got it or not. But he talked about everything is one. You have these little circles, and then you have this really big circle. I know that's how Woody thought about music. That's how Joe Henderson thought about music. That's how Wayne Shorter thought. What key was that in? You know, he said, well, it was in, you don't know what key that was in? you know. It was in just the only key could be in, and that's how they talk to you. It's the only key it could be in. It was in the one key, and it might have gone through so many permutations of tonalities during its statement, you know. So they really thought about that big one kind of thing, which is something that I'm trying to get my head around and to appreciate, you know.
Yeah, well, I think that's the beauty of the symmetrical scales. It doesn't matter which note, if you're thinking of them as scales, not so
Yes.
much as chords,
Yes.
it doesn't matter which one you start on,
Yes.
it sounds the same.
Yes.
If you start your whole tone scale on E, it's the same scale as if you started on B.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same. So it is all one
Yeah.
in that way. That's what's so cool about the symmetrical structures
Yes.
is it releases you from those hierarchies. There's no more hierarchy.
It's about gravity.
It's about gravity and not about hierarchy.